Good morning, guys, and welcome to this new lecture. Today I'm going to cover a subject that is really dear to me, and although from a distance I hope to communicate to you my passion about it. In fact, we are going to talk about psychology, which is then my subject, and we will then talk about Freud and the birth of psychoanalysis. Meanwhile, what is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis could be defined as a kind of therapeutic treatment aimed at people who have an unease of a psychic nature. However, it can also have other meanings. It can also indicate a general theory of personality beyond what are the therapeutic applications I was talking about just now. The founder of psychoanalysis is Freud. Freud is a character who really left a mark in that he was precisely the founder of psychoanalysis. However, his basis of study started from a medical basis. In fact, he was a brilliant Viennese doctor who in the 1885 decided to specialize, once he finished his studies, in diseases, in disorders of a nervous nature. Let's say that at the time there was a lot of confusion in the field of psychiatry. There were a lot of flaws even in the treatments of disorders of this kind. And so let's say Freud brought great innovations precisely because of that. Let's say he focused mainly on what were the hysterical disorders that so many people suffered from, especially women, and especially women who were also quite rich and wealthy. Like any disease, we are used to defining a disease, for example, the flu, or rather than chickenpox, through a clinical picture. That is, to define that a person is sick with that thing, we have to make a clinical picture and then see what the symptomatology is. And once we identify the symptomatology, we can say that person has that kind of disease rather than another. The same thing applies to disorders of a nervous nature, in this case in hysterical disorders. The clinical picture is divided into two major areas. The first one is symptoms of psychological disorders, such as phobias and mental confusion, whereby patients mainly who became ill with these disorders would suddenly manifest phobias that perhaps they did not have before, and then they begin to be afraid of various things or moments of mental confusion that they did not have before. And on the other hand, pathological manifestations on the physical side that are not supported, however, by organic causes. What does this mean? That without an injury to the brain, for example, so without a part of the brain that due perhaps to an accident or something like that no longer functions, so there is no physiological damage, pathological manifestations occur nonetheless on the physical side, but they do not depend precisely on an injury to the brain. For example, it was noticed that these patients often had facial paresis, real temporary paralysis, without having precisely a lesion at the brain level that justified the manifestation. So it would happen that they would suddenly get blocked, for example, the muscles of the face, then after several minutes, even several, like half an hour or things like that, they would unlock. At that time, the approach that was used to try to treat these patients suffering from hysterism was hypnosis. Hypnosis was a technique that Charcot had invented, who was also the teacher, the mentor in some way of Freud, in that Freud took his courses for a couple of years and therefore Freud made this methodology his own in the early years of his practice. Hypnosis is a therapeutic technique that practically allows the hypnotist or the physician in question to bring from a waking state to a sleep-like state of consciousness. The patient, who practically in this hypnotic state does what? Without realizing it, he responds. He tends to respond to what are the requests, therefore the questions that the hypnotist asks. He therefore passively accepts what are precisely the questions, the requests of the doctor, without realizing that he is precisely responding. What does the patient then do under hypnosis? He begins to recall those memories, those things that he had forgotten, and he often manages to bring out things that he has no memory of, but that nevertheless are part of him. At this point, somehow the cause of the problem that led then to the manifestation of these symptoms and precisely the identification of this pathology often comes out. By recalling precisely these feelings that he had forgotten, The patient then, once awake, is then instructed by the hypnotist, when the patient is prepared and ready to accept what are precisely these things that come out during hypnotic sessions. And slowly it was seen that with the diminishing of the symptoms, so for example the diminishing of the manifestation of fears, phobias, or moments of mental confusion or facial paresis, the patients finally began to heal. Because thanks precisely to hypnosis, they were reliving these feelings and thoughts related to the experience that had somehow originated them. Emblematic is the case of Anna O., a lady who was treated precisely by Freud and who was terrified of water, and one did not understand why, because before she did not have this problem. Then it turns out that through hypnosis precisely, that during an evening she had been in contact with another lady who was not very sympathetic to her and who had made her dog drink water from her glass, and therefore this had led then to a fear of water. We talked precisely about these feelings being recalled, but where did these feelings, these emotions that people somehow tend to forget but still carry with them, hide? Freud says they are hidden in the unconscious. The unconscious, according to Freud, is the deepest level of our psyche and is totally inaccessible to our conscious thought. So it's kind of like a Pandora's box in which all the evils of the world were hidden and which we keep within us but are not aware of it. However, it is part of us. Freud at this point divides what is the conscious material from the unconscious material that is part of our mind, and tells us that basically the conscious contents are only a very small part of all our psychic territory, while most of our psychic territory is precisely formed by the unconscious. What is the link that precisely binds the unconscious with the conscious, or rather how these elements, these feelings, these emotions are somehow moved into the unconscious? Freud answers this question by saying that there is a defense mechanism called the mechanism of removal, by which we unconsciously move all these unpleasant, traumatic, sad contents that we somehow move away from our conscious thought, and without realizing it, we embed them, put them into the unconscious. This mechanism is called the removal mechanism. There is precisely a removal of precisely these feelings, these emotions, from the conscious to the unconscious. How can the unconscious be explored? Given that Freud, as I told you before, uses in the first part of his career hypnosis, he took precisely this technique from Charcot, his mentor. At a certain point, however, being a very brilliant mind, he decides to abandon this system, this procedure, because he invents one of his own that still today represents, let's say, the main therapeutic core of psychoanalysis, and that is the method of free associations. In fact, Freud decides, through precisely his experiments, to no longer act in patients in a state of hypnosis, but decides to work with patients who are awake, therefore in a waking state and conscious, as precisely through the method of free associations. What happens with this method? The patient in an awake state is invited by the therapist to report any thought that comes to his mind without censorship. That is, the therapist does not apply any kind of censorship towards precisely what is being told by the patient. This uncensorship, this failure to say block the other's speech, implies that the patient somehow releases his defenses and does not alter the flow of what are unconscious psychic processes. What does this mean? That basically, like a flooding river, then the unconscious somehow comes out, and then the therapist can act on that. This method is made possible through transference. What is transference? Put in very simple words, transference means precisely displacement. Transfer by the subject of feelings, attitudes, emotions that are related to a significant figure in one's life. For example, a father, mother, brother, or uncle onto the figure of the analyst. That is, what does this mean? That basically, without realizing it, when a therapeutic relationship is created, through transference, the patient transfers these emotions, these feelings, etc., that he or she feels towards a family member, a very dear person, onto the figure of the analyst, and thus speaks to us even more serenely and lets out even more serenely this stream of unconscious thoughts. Mind you, transference happens automatically, it is true, however it can and is also very normal, being a relationship of two, for countertransference to happen. What is countertransference? Countertransference is the same displacement of emotions, feelings and attitudes that the patient reposes in the therapist and becomes precisely the opposite. That is, the therapist displacing his feelings, attitudes and emotions on the patient, who may, however, in his life symbolize a child, for example, a parent, and therefore there is a relationship that becomes bidirectional. On one side there is transference and on the other side there is countertransference. How does the unconscious manifest itself in daily life? Freud says that the unconscious manifests itself in two ways, either awake or asleep. While awake through missed acts, these missed acts are mistakes that the subject makes without realizing it. For example, they are the famous Freudian slips. That is, mistakes that we make without realizing it. For example, we say one word when we would like to say another. We all get them. Freud says that these are seemingly meaningless mistakes, but in fact they can be interpreted as a phenomenon of removal, and therefore going to analyze them, they certainly have a very deep meaning because it is the unconscious that is suggesting something to us. While we are asleep, dreams are, according to Freud, the high road to knowledge of the unconscious. And so from a perceptual point of view, dreams are considered to be hallucinations, obviously healthy hallucinations. They are not the hallucinations that you can have while awake, if, for example, someone takes a hallucinogen or things like that, but they are healthy hallucinations because we all do them, i.e., in dreams they are considered hallucinations because they are disperceptions of reality. In dreams we can do anything. We can fly, we can be chased by monsters, we can do things that in reality cannot be done. That's why they are considered perceptual hallucinations.